what I'm doing now is I'm going to look at some research conducted around 2013 or so. So it's quite a while ago, but it started there. There's lots of theoretical and methodological development, if you like. And so I'm going to go forward with that. I'm going to start by talking about the research. I'm also going to then do an elaborate research context, because this relates to the way that I'm theorizing and thinking through data produced by the research project. I'll also do a brief detour to the theoretical threads that I'm using in the analysis, look more specifically at the research focus, and then provide analysis along those three analytical lines, and finally look at the implications. So to start with then, the research, what I'm presenting today is actually encapsulated in the paper that is listed at the top there, and it is a collaboration between myself, Sarah Humphreys, who many of you know, and Salihu Bakari, who is actually in charge of the Tech Fund in Nigeria. At the time we did this research, he was the director of basic education in Adamawa State. And the paper, what I'm presenting today, comes from that second listed publication there, which is a project in which we looked at primary education in Adamawa State with a special interest in gender. The research team of the bigger project, the Adamawa State Primary Education Project, included Moses Dauda, Jidore Kaibo, Ayo Garuba, Salihu, and Sarah and myself. The actual study was to look at 6 primary school case studies using ethnographical approaches. We took them from 3 regions within Adamawa State, from the north to the south. 2 were very rural and 4 were urban. They differed in size from 500 to 3,000 pupils. They differed in terms of gender, the predominant religion of the school pupils, and their ethnic populations. And our original focus was to look at access and quality and outcomes, with particular focus on gender. And this involved multiple site visits to these 6 schools, observation, interviews, and document collection. So that's the broad picture of what the research study was. And this presentation draws from that. So just to give you a little bit of background, we have got Nigeria here, and Nigeria is famous or infamous for having the highest number of children out of school. It's got over 8 million children out of school, and that equates to about 68% of children in primary school. So there's a big, big gap. I'm looking at the map now, and you can see that there are 3 regions here that are in northern Nigeria. These are described as northern Nigeria, and these are described as southern Nigeria. The north of Nigeria is heavily influenced by Islam that came through the trans-Saharan trade amongst many avenues into the north of Nigeria, and it is distinctly different in lots of ways from the southern states, which had colonialism coming in through Lagos, etc., by European colonizers and traders, actually. The state that I'm looking at is this one here, Adamawa. So it is in the northeast of the country, and it borders Cameroon. And although we tend to think of the north as predominantly Muslim, and indeed it is, there are lots of Christians in the north. So lots of Yorubas and Igbos, who are the 2 other main tribes besides the Hausas, have internally migrated there and set up businesses there. So, and you see that reflected in the schools. So I'm talking about this state here that borders on Cameroon. The second important context of this research is indeed development aid as part of the Policyscape. I'm talking about decentralisation, but I can't talk about it without looking at development as a key structure of how we understand and how even decentralisation is put into place. Often development is talked about as progress. We often think of it as linear trajectories, and I've tried to show here the way that countries like the US, the UK, Europe, and Japan are looked at as the kind of pinnacle of development towards which other countries like Bangladesh, Ethiopia, and Bolivia in the global south aspire. And the idea is that over time, people will reach these dizzy heights of Western countries. However, in that process, there are lots of indicators used to gauge levels of development, and things like GDP, school attendance, literacy, etc., are all brought together to produce an indicator that says whether a country is developed or not, or where it is on this list of countries that go from 1 to around 200. These are measured and repeatedly measured over time, yearly, in fact, their reports. For example, in the global development reports, they show progress over time with lots of indicators. What is important about these is that they have become universal measures, and these universal measures are compared over time, and the emphasis on development is about what happens in timescapes, in the timescape. What this does is, of course, produces hierarchies of development, because you'll see the Nordic countries, Ireland, UK, in the top 5 or 10 of the indicator list, and you'll see places like Niger and Chad in the bottom. So we've got a hierarchy of development. The problem with this is that it objectifies what happens in the developing context, and there's an assumption of fungibility. In other words, that one indicator that happens in the UK, for example, can be substituted for the same indicator in Ethiopia when they are distinctly different. So universal access to primary schooling in the UK looks and feels completely different than it might do in Bangladesh, in Ethiopia. And that emphasis on time measured indicators actually decontextualizes what's happening in countries, and it moves away from a spatial analysis and the social relations in that context. The third research context, of course, is the Policyscape of educational governance. And in a sense, that diagram to the right here is trying to say that the process of decentralisation that produces increased access and increased quality of schools for children actually is an interaction between the education administration, schools, and communities. And that relational diagram is supposed to be at the heart of what decentralisation is. In Nigeria, it's a federal system. So it means that the state of nation state of Nigeria, the actual state, has governance over certain parts of education, but basic education, in which primary schools sit, are decentralized to state governments. They have responsibility for that. In Adamawa State, that is further decentralized through local government areas, where local government authorities have responsibility for basic education within their particular area. And as I said before, decentralization is supposed to involve parents and community members in school-based management committees that in principle have the power to make management decisions about schools. They have the power indeed to hire and fire teachers in principle. However, at the same time, there are also PTA, parent-teachers associations, and these should not be confused because they don't have any management responsibility. And what they do is raise funds or engage with activities at the behest of the school. So it's a very much more responsive to the school than the idea of decentralized local governments of schools. Okay. So just to put that into the larger context, if we're looking at the social relations of the Policyscape, what we have in the development discourse are these imperatives to education for the betterment of the individual, community and state. We have the idea that the reason people are not going to school is because of local or community ignorance. And as a result of the implementation of decentralisation, Adamawa State in particular operated lots and lots of advocacy campaigns, which went out into rural areas to try and persuade parents and communities to support the school and send their children to school. Importantly, this decentralisation positions schools as community organisation. So the rationale for decentralisation is about community participation and it is about democratisation. However, you might also think of it as referring accountability, and accountability that means economic accountability, as well as accountability for getting children into school. You know, there's no such thing as a free lunch. We're not giving you open democracy on the grounds of nothing else. However, the social landscape in Adamawa State, and I have to say, Adamawa State is a state that was put under emergency measures because of the incursions of Boko Haram in 2014, I think, around that time. And I'm not sure that I think it had a reprieve at one time, has gone back into it. So some of the schools that we went into in research are in the north of Adamawa, which were subject to Boko Haram insurgencies. And as we know what happened in the Chibok case, issues about security were rife. So going back to the social landscape here, it is one of poverty. It is one where parents haven't been to school. So there is very little intergenerational experience or understanding of schooling. In parts of this state, is 28% literacy, only 28%. There is an issue about Western education, as often chanted by Boko Haram people, but this issue of Western education, particularly in the Muslim dominant areas, added to their little intergenerational experience of schooling, there was practically no experience of management or involvement in politics of local communities. And then on top of that, it is a very hierarchical society. Schools and teachers are dominant, and community and parents are viewed as if in deficit. So you can see that to put decentralization into this context isn't anything we could see by a line on a graph. We have to actually go and see what's happening. And in this analysis of our data, research data, I'm pointing to 4 theoretical threads. The first is the Policyscape itself, which talks about the social, political, and historical landscape of policy. It is not just the official texts and its imperatives from elsewhere. It is about how it lands in space. We were also thinking through the work of Foucault, who talks about governmentality. So although we've got what I've described as a philanthropic haze, this idea of educational governance for all to take part in, it is actually a strategy of governmentality with dividing practices that categorize and separate particular populations and reinscribe normalized power relations. Of course, I can't talk about policy related to the Policyscape without also talking about Stephen Ball and his profuse complexities of the local. And that's what we were looking at. We weren't looking at what the policy said, we were looking at what happened. And of course, in this way, we were looking at power geometries of the local. So we're trying to look at a relational look at the place where decentralisation was supposed to be happening. And these included space, place, the physical, the temporal, and how these are socially and materially constructed. Okay, so, God, I've talked for ages. I'm going to go very quickly. We were looking at schools as community organisations and the power dynamics, and these generally went around the boundaries of the school. And it was about the way the school regulated its boundary and also how community members legitimated or not. And this is to help us understand the agonistic relations across those boundaries, which are not only about space, they're about time, because we have timetables. So the formal structures of engagement are about PTAs and SBMCs. In our research, SBMCs were not functioning. There is very little community participation and certainly an underrepresentation of women and youth. And that was important because in setting out SBMCs, there were particular quota for particular kinds of people. Overall, as I've said before, there was an asymmetrical relationship between the communities and the school in which the community was subordinated. Only 1 in 3 parents ever went to a school. And the PTA was used to fine parents or to raise funds for school projects like buildings. As a whole, there were deficit discourses of parents and community. When you talk to teachers about why children are not coming to school, etc., it was a deficit discourse. The idea that the school, its place and its temporal rhythms were at odds with the families who were struggling to farm, to find food, had particular forms of religious practice, were not really considered. Here are some quotes from people. If we go to the middle one, it says, yes, our children come home to complain to us, for example. They sometimes say they didn't get any lesson today or no teacher entered our class today. We don't have the power to confront the teachers. We are afraid of them. That kind of encapsulates the kind of power dynamic between the schools and their parents. Those names there are just our pseudonyms of the schools. Going to the school boundary then, it's important to know that you're putting a school into a community that may not have had a school before or may have a dilapidated remnant of a school. But the school is important, the boundary of the school is important to establish it, to look at it as a space to exert authority over that space. And it works to regulate flows in and out of the school. It actually works to say who's legitimate in the school and who's not. It regulates community access. And it also is there to regulate teacher and pupil activity. The boundary is there to show who comes late, for example, or to look at who comes at all. Basically, it is an axis of agonistic school community relations. And we can see here, this is one of the school boundaries, a wall there, and actually it's a girl coming in. But in the 6 case studies, only 2 had a continuous school boundary. Some were walls and fences. 2 had very dilapidated boundaries, and this is one of the schools here. And the rural schools didn't have any. They had kind of maybe dilapidated bit of fence on a farm, bit of farmland, but usually they used the roads or other buildings. And this, from Doyer School, this person is saying, this community member is saying, if I'm to change something in this school, I will start by building a fence around the school with a gate. And you can see here, the work at the boundary was both school discipline and for security and safety. Now, this is one of the urban schools that did have a boundary, and you can see that it has got gatekeepers right in place there who allow people in and deter people. And it's got a concrete wall and an iron gate, as well as the 3 men. And the gate security was there, which, along with teachers on duty and punishment, tried to ensure people got inside the school in time and ensured that people were in the right place at the right time, and that outsiders didn't come in. And so here we've got metropolis parents saying, on the issue of boys coming late, we want teachers to flog them and then allow them to enter the class. In some places, they'd flog them and then send them away. And in Doyer, where there is no school boundary, teachers were saying, parents were saying, teachers can't catch latecomers because pupils can decide to come in the school at any angle. So the idea of the boundary as discipline for who is outside, but also for the time at which people came inside, was really important. Added to this, there were also issues about safety and security. After all, pupils in schools are supposed to be in loco parentis and are supposed to be looked after by the schools. So the idea of a school boundary was there to keep the wrong people out, illegitimate people out. However, and there were attempts by schools to allow community members in at fixed times to meet with teachers, to use computer and library facilities. There were only 2 schools with computer facilities, but to use water, and also for hawkers to come in at break times to sell whatever it is they had to sell snacks. However, in all cases, the boundaries are porous. And there was limited capacity for schools to regulate the boundaries, even where they looked concrete like those ones. Pupils and teachers had kind of carved footholes in the walls to get out. And the lack of such security increased teacher and pupil absenteeism, and there was a particular problem over water and sanitation. Pupils would go out and get water, and even teachers, and sometimes never come back to school. Pupils were also at risk from traffic and from undesirable outside, and from hawkers, who didn't only trade in the school grounds, often went into the classrooms to start trying to sell as a lesson was in process. That the increase in parental fears actually had a very negative impact, as you would guess, on pupil access and retention, as well as school quality. So just to give you some little pictures, this is that same wall with a pupil going out, but teachers were often found to go out through this hole in the wall. This is a rural school which had no boundary, and people would ride motorbikes and in certain places drive cars through the school grounds. And this is just a picture in one rural school which had no boundary, where we see an illegitimate visitor, this man, amongst a group of schoolgirls. And here we have hawkers exchanging money. You can see they're holding goods in their little pots down below. And in fact, these 2 girls were also pupils in the school. So they had their their goods under their chair, and when it was break time, they ran out and started selling the pupils around them, their senior pupils around them in uniform. So there were issues with the school boundary, but the school boundary also evoked or provoked resistance. Parents and community members transgressed the boundary. They didn't come in, as the first point is trying to say, to start insulting teachers who were unfairly carrying their children. There were also massive disagreements over land, over the use of water. And because of this, there were constant incursions by the community. As I said before, one school was built across what was by the community regarded as a road. So they drove through the middle of the school, where there was a primary school on one side and the secondary school on the other. They just kept driving through it. And if the school gates were up, community members constantly broke it down. Often, you know, area boys would sit on by the gates and abuse those people going to school. Community members would dump rubbish in the school. And in some cases, they used the school after the school day and used it as a place to party. And often leaving all the rubbish behind them, including human feces, which of course the girls predominantly had to clean up the next day. And there were often Indian hemp smokers around schools in the more urban areas, and they used to hang out, and I'll show you in a second, around toilets, which denied pupils, particularly girls, access to the toilets. So here you can see incursion by animals. And in fact, in some of the classrooms, goat herders would keep the goats in the classroom. So by the morning, it would be full of feces. Here we see a drug taker outside a toilet, and we can see these small girls in the distance there looking and wondering whether they're going to go to the toilet there. That person wasn't alone. There's several people like that. And this was a bar across the road, and these people were the ones amongst those who used the school at night, in the night for partying. So moving swiftly on. I guess what the point is about decentralisation is that just saying the policy of decentralisation and even putting in place government departments and bodies, in this case, has not resulted in community participation. It hasn't resulted in that transfer of power to communities and parents, or the stronger accountability chains in schools and education systems, or improvements in access and quality. Those things which were the promises of educational decentralisation have not happened. And this is largely because there are power asymmetries between educational authorities, schools and communities. And these need to be addressed if we're to get a safe, equitable negotiating space. There is evident need where we've got the example of the school which has got a road going through the middle of it, or where people are driving their livestock. There needs to be much more communication, negotiation about the siting of the school. Although this often happened with people at the local government office who were not necessarily very local and were the elites, it didn't necessarily happen with community members or with parents. What we see specifically from this research is that the spatial and temporal boundaries of the school are a source of conflict with this community. The community incursions, which were frequent and persistent, had serious implications for school access and quality. And the institutional integrity and security of the school, as well as teachers, would seem to suggest the need for a stronger boundary. finally then, just thinking about the methods and the development assumptions that are the background of this study. I think the use of the Policyscape as a way in has important implications for understanding the social, historical and political context that shift away from the widespread and facile explanations of if this policy doesn't work, it is local deficit, it's community deficit that doesn't make it work. That is the rationale behind lots of those advocacy programs. The introduction of a spatial analysis that doesn't only look over time, looks at what's going on in the space, provides a much more nuanced account of decentralisation policy and issues of school access and quality in context. The broader, more local perspective opens space for contextually relevant strategies to address access and quality. If we understand what's going on in locale, we can move to do something about it. But however, it also highlights the complexity of community participation, especially in communities with limited experience of schooling and limited experience of management. It also underlines the possibility that schools and Western education are not the universal objective regarded as neutral or benign by all parents and teachers. Well, teachers perhaps, but all parents and communities. And it raises the issue of the development assumptions and its universalized imperatives. There we go, the end. Okay.
Thank you so much, Máiréad, for this
That's my Zoom now.
presentation. Lots of ideas, lots of things for us to think about and digest. Over to the floor, any questions?
I got to the point where I can't see anybody for some reason. But let me see.
It would be useful if people,
that's
great.
Got it. I can see now. Thank you. Stunned into silence.
Máiréad, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Oh, thank you. Thanks ever so much. It's fascinating, really, really compelling. And I thought a lot of what you said speaks to critiques of the notion of the learning crisis by the World Bank, which pathologizes communities and their teachers and children. But I just wanted to ask you who the teachers are in these schools. Are they not products of these very communities who are precaritized and disempowered? And therefore, did you get evidence which produced a more diverse picture of their agency, such that not all teachers were looking down on the local communities, but some were identifying with the very issues they had with privatization?
Yeah, I mean, these are all state schools, so I wasn't looking at that necessarily. But it's interesting because we were going to do a paper on deployment of teachers, because indeed there's a massive issue about language. I mean, we might just think it's northern Nigeria or Adamawa State, but there are multiple ethnic groups there. And there's a religious divide. So some of the teachers could not have possibly come from those local areas or didn't school in those local areas. Of course, it is true that the head teachers, especially talking to people like me and the researchers who after all came from the state capital, were saying, yes, we're trying to do this with the community. And they had tried, and some had quite strong parent-teachers associations. And the ones in the urban areas had very strong, one was a very strong Muslim school, which had massive support from the Muslim community members around, and actually had probably one of the strongest and most thickest walls around the school. And so there were ways in which they exchanged. But to be honest, lots of the teachers were just fed up. They don't get their money on time. You know, they're going in, students can't stay in school because the rhythm of school don't take into account that they've got to go and dig or they've got to go to the market on market day. So there's lots of discontinuities about how the school linked into the community, if you like.
Yes, fascinating, thanks.
Yes. Yeah. More to be done though, Sean, as you're pointing out.
We have a question from the chat from Denise. To what extent are the head teachers aware of the boundary issues? Do the teachers' unions have a role to play here?
Oh, we're far from teacher unions, because the teacher unions usually point to the state around the conditions of work. Lots of the boundary issues happen and have been complained about by the community members. But there's things like water. Like in one school, there was a well, which is across the road from the school. The school thought the well belonged to the school, and the man who guarded the well said, no, they don't. And he was really representing community interests because they were upset with the way that they had taken in some land that they thought did not belong to the school, that did not belong to the state and the school. So objections to the way that schools are imposed came in multiple ways. And of course, you know, we're talking about northern Nigeria. There are lots of pastoralists who have herds who go through everywhere. You know, the Fulani are near, House of Fulani are around, so that the integrity of the school is lost, and many of them don't even have that boundary. It is a symbolic boundary. Yeah.
Thanks, Máiréad. There is another post from Joe in the chat. Really interesting. Presumably the boundaries of the classroom are also porous, contesting any idea of schools and learning being a safe space, especially for girls. How was learning affected, disrupted in a similar way?
Yeah, there's a paper that we wrote called Counted In and Being Out, which was developed from this data, which talks about the disciplinary force of the school boundary, but also of the classroom, and you know, the use of prefects to beat people. I mean, we are in some of these schools, we are in northern Nigeria, and the threat of Boko Haram is live now. And it was also the idea that the protection of girls was really important. So parents were not always that keen to let their children go into school. And that issue of undue discipline, because there are lots of terrible, physically damaging discipline strategies that teachers use on pupils. And of course, you know, they use pupils to do farming, their own farming. You know, there's lots of practices that don't look much like a school, despite many head teachers really trying, because, you know, teachers to say, well, I'm going to the bank to get my pay. I haven't been paid for months. I've got to go. You know, it's very difficult. Even if you've got a head teacher who wants to exert discipline. In the rural areas in particular, it was very difficult, very difficult.
Can I just quickly ask again? Then there are quite literally there are double boundaries. There's the
Yeah.
schools often have a wall, but then there are also the walls within the classroom, as well as the structure of the timetable. So
Yeah.
what you're saying is that there are not only the counting in, counting out, but the physicality of getting children in and feeling safe and getting on with the timetable is itself disrupted, apart from all the actual the boundaries that you've talked about. There are kind of two concentric boundaries, are there?
Yeah, oh, at least, and then, you know, there's boundaries around males and females that operate within that school space as well. But yes, I mean, pupils did know which classroom they had to go to, and teachers knew which classroom they had to go to, but they were very flexible, and, you know, the extent to which, and I don't want to necessarily paint it as totally hopeless, because there were teachers going into classrooms and without resources. There were students sitting on bits of logs trying to learn something, but then there was an awful lot of non-accountable stuff going on, despite the better efforts of head teachers, head teachers, and local government officers. This is a space where people are not used to schooling, and they're not even sure they want Western schooling. It's a space where pupils who go to the mosque first, girls get up, clean their house, go to the mosque, after hours in the mosque, come to Western education in the school. That's tiring. I mean, that is exhausting. I don't know. But part of it is because schooling has not been instituted. Schooling has not, and probably continues not, to show much positive effect on people's lives either. God, I'm making it sound desperate. I mean, in some ways it really is desperate, but in other ways there are, you know, they have instituted schools, there is a timetable, all of that. There are possibilities for learning, but it is difficult to make that persistent and consistent, especially in places where the times of the year, the market day, if you've got to make money, levels of poverty are really high.
I'll quickly add, I just have a contextual reflection on the context of it, because I'm thinking of my research, and while like the SMCs, the school management committees, and the PTAs were not functional in that context either, but the decentralization policy, you know, it was the Forest Act or the Local Village Council Act, these acts were used to then sort of use the decentralization policy in a way that benefited the community for whatever, you know, the livelihood. If it was for the forest produce, the bamboo, all of that stuff, to keep the state at bay, but to benefit the community. So I'm wondering if there was any strategic, any use of the decentralization policy by the local community that was going on, which was not directly linked to education, but maybe something else.
Communities, in a sense, what this research showed me is that I know very little about anything, about the way that the communities operate in northern Nigeria, because we've got an ethnic and a religious divide, and we've got people who are coming in, you know, to do trading, etc., etc. So there is a big mix that goes on inside them. And even the very idea, theoretically, of what is a community is troubled. You know, is the community just the parents? Is the community those people who live nearby? Because certainly in this research, the people who live nearby were complaining about the school taking the water or encroaching on their grazing land. you know, so the community is very troubled in a sense. And this community is in a space where Western education is pushed by the state, but where, not totally, but, you know, there is a strong influence of Islam, which if taken in a kind of simplistic way, would suggest that Western education, Islam are opposites. And in the midst of all that, we've got an issue of what do we do with girls? We don't want them to be kidnapped. We don't, you know, we need the girls for a time. We need them for quite a long time. They are our wealth. So, you know, the idea of community cohesion is very difficult, because everybody's striving for that bit of land, for those crops, for, you know, whatever it is. When you come more to the urban areas, we can see it more explicitly played out, where you've got a big community of Igbos from the south who are the people who go to market. And then you've got Al-Majiri, who are the boys who are sent to an imam from wherever. They're effectively, the imam is acting as their parent, and they go round and their duty is to beg for alms, you know, and that's how it plays out. So you have to be very careful. At the same time, you know, this local government is actually dominated by Muslims who know their communities better. They know about schooling. So they have the way to be able to speak. You know, so there's lots of positives going on there, but it's just a long way to go. And if you're just putting in, let's all do decentralisation and let's all go to school 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, in the seasons that don't apply, you're not on a very good starter for getting people into school. So, you know, while I have referred to religion, religion is not a massive thing. It is true that people go to different schools depending on their religion predominantly. But the massive thing is about the lifestyles of these people who are in poverty, who don't feel like they've got a power to talk in a very hierarchical society. It is not like there is legislation to cover this. This is about who you know, writ large. Who do you know? It's about clientelism in lots of ways.
We have 5 minutes left. There is one question from the chat from Aza.
Oh, Asa.
Máiréad, do you think that local community and teachers can resist that regulations?
I think they can. Ideally, they can. I think they can. But whether they can in this particular situation is another question, because people are vulnerable. And so everything, even to get yourself counted, which you have to do if you get to school, you are on a list there. Even to get yourself counted is a danger. People can follow you and find out who you are, if you know what I mean. But I think there are teachers that do, and there are schools in very difficult areas saying, look, we've got library and we've got 3 computers. You know, you can come in on Tuesday evenings to do that. You know, there's real efforts, but it is at a very local level. It's almost kind of ignoring massive regulation or top-down regulation. And, you know, there's creative accounting that goes on. You know, head teachers get paid by the number of pupils they have in the school. So nobody checks that. You can guess that the number of pupils they have in the school is more. When you go in there, you see only 5 people in the classroom, you're thinking, how did they have 200 people in this year? You know, and that's multiple difficulties. Yeah. So the answer is they can, but I think you have to do it in small ways because the risks otherwise are massive.
Ask another question. Fascinated.
And also Martha raised her hand. So
Okay.
Dawn and then Martha, and 5 minutes, 4 minutes left.
Who's going first?
I wonder if Son and Martha could give us the questions all together, and then
Okay.
because we have very few minutes left.
Okay.
Martha, you go ahead.
Go ahead, Son.
Oh, no.
Well, okay, yeah, sure. Sorry, yeah. I was thinking, I completely, absolutely take your point about the way the very proxy and pointlessness of some of the indicators generated within the universalizing development discourse. And
Yeah.
your theoretical strands are all really relevant to that. But I was thinking they are Western theoretical strands, essentially, space. And I'm thinking, did you find room for drawing on an alternative conceptualization of learning and its intersections with community life, which would be more rooted in African indigenous approaches, and indeed Islamic approaches, as a counter narrative to build into a theoretical critique of privatization? Anyway, sorry. I mean, we only got 2 minutes, so you hardly answer that question. But I thought that just want to reflect on also conceptualizing learning. Yeah.
Thanks. Can we also take Martha's question? So and then Máiréad, you do what you want to do with it.
Okay.
Martha, over to you.
Thank you. It really was fascinating because I could see so many parallels with contexts that I'm familiar with in India. And this whole deficit that's there, deficit discourses, this how the community is not the agency, maybe sometimes isn't as much as recognized. I was wondering to what degree could the school play a role in facilitating and creating spaces, even though they do try, and many times there's this, as you said, there's this fatigue that, oh, we've tried, they don't come, but there is this distance between the community and the parents and the teachers. But what could be other research questions that one could explore in terms of spaces that bring them together? In terms of what would ownership of a community mean in such a context where power relations are really distorted in a way, and there's so many boundaries, even symbolically there's so many boundaries. So were there examples of schools initiating spaces, or I mean, the school management committees are one means to do it, but then again, there haven't been many positive examples of that happening. So
yeah. Well, I don't know if I'm going to be able to manage, but I'll say something now. Both questions, but they're slightly different. I mean, I think that the important point of this paper is to reflect on, if you like, and critique the way that development makes decisions and calculates and compares places that are completely different. The fact that we've got schools that look all ready to go in technical detail is a response to something that's driven from outside. It is not organic as such, and that produces its problem. The fact that we're fixed on schools and people in classrooms and whatever it is problematic. I mean, having said that, there are, so the idea of different kind of learning, this is about school learning. It isn't about accepting other kinds of learning, it's about school learning. And if we look at timetables across the world, we'll have the same thing. We'll have maths and language and whatever it is. And so it is about a specific codified language that has become more important than anything else. And then it's about the imposition of policies in places that people who make these policies have got no idea about. How do we start doing decentralisation where there is no sense of community responding or the government responding to the community? These are diktats upon which development aid is built. And what we see is that deficit of local communities built up into deficits of countries. And so we have the hierarchy that is reproduced and rolled out all across the place. So there's a massive issue there. I am not one who's saying the communities and those people who, after all, are educated, the teachers who know about formal education, I'm not saying there's no meeting. And in fact, the children who go to their Islamic education in the morning are doing that. They are very located in the communities, and people are coming in and learning the Quran and learning how to be with other people and learning what that duty is. I mean, whether you want to agree with it or not, that is still happening, and it is instituted. There are institutes in which children are going to. For others who are not of that kind, the church also fulfills a role because they go to church. So we can't be in this place that has either got, you know, Islamophobia or no religion, which has been the history of the way we theorize development for a long time now. And, you know, that does not reflect how people are and live and what people think is important. Now, whether we agree with it or not, or whether the idea of democratization is the most important thing, then we have to label it as that. And we can't start comparing Chad, you know, to France. It's ridiculous. And we can't keep doing it to make some places look in deficit and other places look like sparkling examples, because we know they're not in either way. So anyway, that was a big about the importance of framing the way we look. And it depends on your audience. You know, I want to say this back to the people who are doing development and saying, let's roll out decentralisation. You can't do that. You can't do that with your temporal analysis. We need to have a spatial analysis that tells us what's happening on the ground. But nevertheless, I don't think the World Bank are going to stop. And neither am I, for that matter. There you go. Yeah. So,
on a positive note, we want to thank you, Máiréad, for the very stimulating presentation and sharing your thoughts with us. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today.